Hello, I'm Keith Stroup, the legal counsel of NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, and I am the guest host today on Afterwards here on C-SPAN. My guest author today is John McCaslin, nationally syndicated columnist at the Washington Times, where for nearly 2 decades he's penned his often biting, sometimes muckraking, Inside the Beltway columns, which he describes as purely anecdotal. He has been a journalist for 25 years, previously working as a news broadcaster and photographer, a wire service stringer, and a White House correspondent. And most relevant to this program, Mr. McCaslin is the author of 2 books, Inside the Beltway, Offbeat Stories, Scoops, and Shenanigans from Around the Nation's Capital, published by Thomas Nelson in 2004, and earlier this year, Weed Man, The Remarkable Journey of Jimmy Devine, by the same publisher, the book we are here to discuss today. Welcome, Mr. McCaslin.
Thank you, Keith. Appreciate it.
Let me start by saying, and if we can, we'll switch to first names. John, you are a journalist who has for 2 decades written a regular column about life inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C. Your previous book was a collection of stories gained from your experiences as a journalist over these last 2 decades. Weed Man, the story of a Bahamian marijuana smuggler, is quite a different book. What attracted your interest in writing such a story, which on the surface appears to be light years away from your real life and professional interests? Were you responding to some personal fantasy life in your mind? Or did your interest perhaps reflect some personal experience in your life? Had you ever met or known anyone, for example, in this business prior to meeting Mr. Moray, aka Jimmy Devine?
You know, I guess, Keith, the best way to sum that up is that I stumbled into this book the same way that Jimmy Devine stumbled into marijuana trafficking. It was totally by accident, a profitable one for him, very lucrative, and one worth telling a story about. And about 3 or 4 years ago, I purchased a home down on a tiny little Bahamian island called Harbor Island, where the book begins and ends as well. It's one of the out islands in the Bahamas. You have to get to it by boat. It's a 1/4 mile wide by 3 miles long. And the baker on the island, a guy named Robert Arthur, is also the minister. He actually used to splice tape for Larry King back in his early days in Miami, but he's a native Bahamian. And he's also the real estate agent. And he had sold me the house, and he came by one day and thought I'd like to meet a couple. It's a local couple on the island, and he drove me up to Jimmy's house with his wife, Hannah, who's a Canadian by birth. And after listening to 2 hours of stories that were just fascinating to me, I realized that he had never once told me what he did for a living to have experienced all these incredible things that people can read about in this book. And I've chosen the best stories of all the tales he told. And he looked at his wife and he said, "Should I tell him?" In this beautiful Bahamian accent. He's a white Bahamian. One of the minorities there. His family's been there for a couple hundred years in the Bahamas. They were original buccaneers or pirates working for the British Crown. And he proceeded to tell me that at one time, as you'll read about in the book, he was a huge drug trafficker between Colombia and the United States, and did so for a good decade before he was eventually indicted by Uncle Sam.
You mentioned the unlikely beginning of this, or selection of this profession by Jimmy, and I thought that was a fascinating basis to start. Do you want to share with our listeners exactly how he got into the business?
Jimmy is a very health-conscious individual. What's interesting about Jimmy as a drug trafficker, one would think that they would partake in perhaps a little bit of the weed and what they're selling, to know what they're selling. And Jimmy is a teetotaler. He does not drink alcohol. He has never tried marijuana in his life. He's never put a cigarette in his mouth. He's a health-conscious nut and was jogging before any Americans took it up. He used to be a kickboxer growing up in the Bahamas and would compete throughout the islands, even got a few trips to the United States to compete. And Jimmy was jogging on the beach one day in a remote part of Abaco where he was a scuba diving instructor. He had just gotten married. And he found himself jumping over a bale. And he thought to himself, as naive as he was about drugs, believe it or not, he thought to himself, what's Hay doing in the Bahamas? And then he looked around on the beach, and there were many more bales. There were a total of 40 bales total. And he drove rather excitedly to the one policeman on the island, who was a big black gentleman who he called Sarge. They used to play dominoes together and shoot pool together in the one local place. They would play dominoes in the jail together. And he said to Sarge, all this marijuana is floating up on shore. And the Sarge said, "What'd you do with it?" He said, "Well, most of it's still there. I pulled a couple bales up by the dunes." And the first thing the Sarge said to him is, "Do you know anybody that might want to buy it?" And that just showed you, if you want to call it corruption, you can call it that there was in the Bahamas in those days. It ended up with the Prime Minister many years later. They tried to oust him from office, charging that he was accepting bribe money from some of the cocaine traffickers, one in particular in the Bahamas. So there was a lot of that was going on, a lot of collaboration with regard to the various islanders. And Jimmy ended up selling these bales of marijuana that floated up. It turned out to be high-grade Colombian weed to one of his contacts in Nassau, who would ultimately become his partner, because this guy was already trafficking marijuana.
Was that the chief?
That was the chief, and I call him the chief. I don't identify him by name. Some of the crew I do identify in the book, others I don't, by their nicknames. And the chief has since passed away. And Jimmy ended up becoming his partner eventually, and they worked basically uninterrupted. There was virtually no law enforcement presence at all in the Bahamas back then. I would say until Ronald Reagan came to office, when the DEA was finally able to open up an office in Nassau, and the rest is history. He basically was operating undisturbed.
I believe I recall you said that first supply of marijuana he stumbled on the beach, he was eventually paid something like $350,000 for that.
He could not believe how much money he made from that. And if you think it's unusual that Jimmy Devine would stumble upon bales of marijuana back in the early 1970s, right around the turn there of the decade, I'll let you know that on the day that Barack Obama was inaugurated this year in Washington, a friend of mine who's a lobbyist here in town, a very well-known one at that, was down on Harbor Island, where he's been going for years with his family, and many bales floated in that day. So it's still continuing to this day.
I have a feeling you're not going to be left alone on Harbor Island much longer when people start hearing that happens.
That's true.
In your book, you make a clear distinction between those engaged in smuggling marijuana and those who smuggle other drugs, especially cocaine. Mm-hmm. At several points in the book, you make it clear that Jimmy, as you mentioned, the central character, does not like cocaine and doesn't care much for those who smuggle it or otherwise deal in it. Mm-hmm. This seemed to be something you felt strongly about, so perhaps you could begin by expanding on that a bit. Let me ask you a couple of follow-ups on that. Do you view personal drug use as something that carries a moral stigma? In other words, in law school, what we were taught was that offenses under the common law that were bad offenses were considered malum in se, that roughly transfers from Latin into bad in and of itself. They're violent crimes, rape, robbery, murder. Or is drug use malum prohibitum, which is bad because we prohibit it, but not immoral? What's your view on drug use?
Well, you've got to realize that there is a drug in tobacco that we smoke. There is a drug in the alcohol that we drink. These are legal. They weren't at one time, as you know. And we have other drugs that might not be as dangerous. You mentioned cocaine and what I wrote in the book. Jimmy, if I can just digress back to Jimmy Devine, he despised cocaine because he saw what it did to his partner, the chief, who ultimately died of it. Jimmy has never thought, nor do many people in the Bahamas think, that marijuana is that bad. It's a plant. You guys have done studies. The Marijuana Policy Project has done studies that show if you smoke marijuana, out of, I believe, 107 cases, maybe in one, it led to a harder drug where they could prove that. Yeah. And we can get into all that debating side by side. So that's why there is the issue now, and you know this better than I do from your position, having founded NORML, is whether marijuana could be not only legalized, we're already finding it's useful medicinally, but if so, how would we control it, as the government does with regard to alcohol and with regard to tobacco?
Was it your intent to suggest, and it seemed to me it may have been, that criminalizing drugs may be justified in some situations because of the potential harm to the user, but not other drugs like marijuana, as you suggest, where most people think, for example, no one's ever died in the history of mankind from an overdose from marijuana. You can't do it. We even had a witness at one administrative hearing a number of years ago that testified that in order to have a fatal overdose from marijuana, you'd have to ingest 1,600 pounds at one setting.
Wow.
And I've had some friends who've tried it, but you just simply can't do that. Yet with alcohol, we lose about 30,000 people a year in this country just from overdose, not from driving drunk. And from tobacco, of course, it's something like 430,000 people a year. So I guess the question I would have, did you have friends or family who you've seen the damage that cocaine can do, and did that have something to do with your impression and the impression you left in this book?
No, in fact, I gave no personal impression or observation or position in the book, and I was careful not to do that. It's 300 pages on the nose, I believe, in terms of print. And I let Jimmy speak for himself on that. I wanted to keep myself out of it. In other interviews, people have asked me, well, gee, do you think marijuana should be legalized? And I try not to take a position on it. As a journalist here in Washington for almost 30 years, I always try to present both sides. And we know both sides about it. But I do believe that if marijuana was regulated the way they have regulated other drugs, that I can see the argument that the proponents of legalization have, and that is the responsible use of the drug. That is, whether it's used at home between a husband and a wife at night, and if there's a means, and they tell me there is a means, that if you're going to go out and drive and you're going to be stoned, so to speak, quote unquote, that they can tell that you are, and you're going to get a ticket like you would with DWI. I know that there's concerns with regard to youth. If you legalize it, will more use it? I don't know whether more youth have used cigarettes because they're legalized. There's studies, I guess, that point both ways. So I don't take a personal position on it. I can tell you what Barack Obama has said, and we can get into that later. And I can tell you what one of my colleagues, Clarence Page, the columnist for the Chicago Tribune, nationally syndicated, very well known here in Washington, he came out in April and told Barack Obama, free the weed, dude. Let's go ahead and legalize it. Let's get everything we can from it for the economy, to help bolster the economy. Look, it's the biggest cash crop in the country right now.
Without question.
Without question. Without question.
I suppose I should lay my cards on the table, too. I first smoked marijuana when I was a freshman in law school at Georgetown in 1965. I've been a regular smoker ever since. When I go home in the evening, if I'm not traveling, I pour myself a glass of wine and I roll a joint. So I've been smoking for something like 44 years or something at this point. So I, too, I have an obvious point of view. It seems to me that there's a middle ground for other drugs. I would love to see marijuana where it is regulated similar to alcohol. You mentioned the fear some people have with children. Well, if we had age controls, we'd have better control over keeping it out of the hands of children. You don't have age controls on the black market. The person that runs the risk of being arrested and sent to jail is not going to ask for an ID before he sells you his marijuana. But there are other drugs, and as you suggested, Jimmy felt, cocaine in particular, where most of us have either had personal experience or we've had a lot of friends who did. And it does seem to be terribly dangerous. It's awfully hard to use in a responsible manner. People get carried away with it. So I guess the question is, can you imagine a situation where for the more dangerous drugs, we might stop treating users like criminals. That is, it would be a public health problem. You would get them medical help if they need it. But we would continue criminal penalties against sellers and smugglers. That's generally called decriminalization. Is that a middle ground that offers any appeal?
I think it is with regard to the proponents, and I've heard arguments on both sides. And you talked about Jimmy and one of the problems he had, and we spoke about it from a health standpoint, from a trafficking standpoint, cocaine. He saw a tremendous difference when cocaine came onto the scene. It wasn't on the scene, it wasn't as popular in the United States as marijuana was at the beginning of this book. And it gradually did come into the Caribbean from South America. Jimmy said that they were an entirely different smuggler than the marijuana smuggler he'd been accustomed to. They never had any guns on their boats. They were a group of guys that were out. You
mean marijuana smugglers?
Marijuana smugglers. And Jimmy specifically told me that. I can't speak for all marijuana smugglers, but it wasn't a dangerous game back then, even though they were dealing with a cartel, one in particular in Colombia. But with regard to the cocaine traffickers, Jimmy said that changed everything completely, and I think it did with the DEA, too. That's when it got bloody for them. They lost 2 DEA agents. One was assassinated in Colombia, Enrique Camarena. I covered that case in Mexico in 1985. I went down with the Attorney General on that and the head of the DEA on the same plane. So I've seen the dangerous side of it. Jimmy saw the dangerous side of it. He hated the cocaine traffickers. He hated what they brought into the Caribbean and what they did to the community. And I can tell you, the Bahamas have had a tremendous problem with cocaine. Not as bad now as it used to be. Marijuana, you know, I point out in the book, and I wanted to make this point, why did all the citizens partake in this in terms of allowing the trafficking to take place and indeed participating in it? Because as you'll read in the book in some of these hilarious stories, and I picked some of the better ones of a stack that tall of dialogue with Jimmy, the fishermen were involved, the lobster fishermen, other fishermen, farmers were involved, marina owners, people that would control a runway strip. They were constantly bringing in marijuana. And one preacher in the book, a black Bahamian on a very remote island, who with the proceeds of marijuana got his pulpit built and the pews for his church. Jimmy asked him, he said, do you feel bad about taking this money that you know came from an illegal operation to basically get your pews and get your pulpit and the chairs that go next to it? And he gave him a good quote, and I've got it in the book, if Solomon smoked it, I must be able to sell it. And he made the point, because Solomon talks about it in the Bible.
I would have to say that I think Jimmy and I also have something in common there. When I was practicing law for a few years in the late 70s, early 80s, I was with a small law firm. We represented only drug traffickers. They were the people who hired us. We specialized in that area. By that point, most of the people getting busted weren't marijuana smugglers. They weren't the college kid we had all known. They were cocaine smugglers and cocaine dealers. And I concede that it seemed to me that most of these people were simply criminals. They were scammers. If they wouldn't have been selling cocaine, I think they would have had some other illegal activity. So after 3 or 4 years, frankly, I did not find the work very satisfying, stepped aside and went back to public interest work. I think if I would have been practicing law in the 60s, when most of the cases would have been marijuana dealers, I think I would have enjoyed it much more. Let me move to another aspect here. For most of my adult life, it has been considered politically incorrect for one to publicly suggest that those who traffic in any drugs, including marijuana, and especially those who smuggle and bring it into the country, are real people with friends and families they love and with the same range of interests and emotions and concerns that the rest of us have. We are expected and sometimes are required to follow that party line. Otherwise, you don't get on programs like C-SPAN or you don't get your book published.
Right.
Yet that appears to be changing right now in our popular culture. We've got programs like Weeds and Family Guy that were just nominated for an Emmy. Weeds, the protagonist, the central character, is a housewife who sells marijuana to help support herself.
Right.
Family Guy, they had a wonderful scene recently where they had a song and dance, and it was very extravagant, at least for a cartoon, in which the name of the song was A Bag of Weed, and it was suggested that most of the world's problems could be solved if they just simply had a bag of weed. And that's one of the most popular things on YouTube in the last few weeks. None of that would have been allowed on the air just a few short years ago, especially on a television network. And after all, in this case, Family Guy's on Fox, which you wouldn't necessarily expect.
If I can interject,
Please
I was
do.
interviewed by Bob Schieffer at CBS probably about a month or a month and a half ago, and that's on YouTube now. Everybody's watching that on YouTube. And I walked out of CBS here in Washington through the control room. And of course, Bob is the host of Meet the Press every Sunday. And there was an old timer in the control room who's worked with Bob, he said, for about 30+ years. And he goes, come on over here. I just got to tell you, I've been doing this program for 30-some years, and I have never heard Bob Schieffer ever talk about bong hits before. so it is incredible how suddenly it is back in the news these days.
Well, now, it seemed to me your book fits right in that. You come along with this marijuana smuggler, Jimmy, and aside from his smuggling, he seems like the boy next door. He's a good person. He loves his family, and who, once he's financially successful, in fact, returns to his home island where he, in a version of Robin Hood, gives away envelopes with $5,000 in cash to a lot of friends and neighbors and family members. So, again, that leads to a few questions.
Yeah.
Was it difficult for you to get your publisher to publish a book that seems to humanize a pot smuggler? Did the publisher try to get you to tone down that side of the story? And was it more difficult to get this book published, because it's the same publisher, than your first book, which was more traditional?
When I published this first book, Inside the Beltway, with the publisher, I signed a contract that the next 2 books they would have first right of refusal if, in fact, I wrote 2 more books. And I was meeting with them here in Washington to sign a contract to do a story on the Reagan White House. And specifically one individual there that I don't want to tell you who he is because I might still write the book. And they came down with everything but the contract in hand to discuss this book with me, and I had just gotten back from the Bahamas, and I told them the story. It was the president of the company and the publisher himself. And I had told them the story about this encounter I just had, this individual I just met, Jimmy Devine, and they were fascinated by some of these stories that are in the book. And they said, why don't you write about it? And again, they weren't giving me the go-ahead at that point. They wanted to make sure there was something different about this individual than other drug traffickers, which I guess are a dime a dozen when you look at the number of drugs that have been brought into the country. And as you pointed out, there's a lot of bad people. So, and it's a respectable publisher, the oldest publisher in the United States. In fact, Thomas Nelson published the first Bibles in this country back in the 1700s, which is why they're the
and
oldest.
now we have the Bible for smugglers.
And now we have Weed Man, and don't think they didn't think about it, and don't think they might not have wanted a different title. But I came up with that title and subtitle, and I think it's worked very well because Jimmy, just to digress quickly, they called themselves Weed People. We were just weed people. We never thought we were doing anything wrong. So anyway, I went back to the island and interviewed Jimmy and got a few more stories down that I could come back, and they signed a contract without really knowing what would go into the book. And I'm going to go ahead and say right here that, you know, I wasn't paid handsomely for this. I wanted to do this book as a favor to Jimmy. I've always liked him very much since I've met he and his wife. And again, we're neighbors on this island. And so, yeah, it was, I think, the first type of book they have ever published. And there were a few little things changed in it, but you know what, this is more of an adventure story as opposed to any facts and figures about drugs. You're not going to read a lot about that in there. It's almost a Robinson Crusoe type island adventure. You talked about Robin Hood and how he would bring the money home to this tiny little island where he grew up, and he would pay back the old farmers and fishermen that helped care for his mother when he couldn't be there to do it as she grew older and more frail. And it basically put several of their children through college in doing so. So he had this side to him that I knew would be appealing, not just to the publisher, more importantly to the reader, because you've got to sell a book. And in this day and age, the publishing industry has been hit like the newspaper industry, and I can speak about that. But anyway, it's turned out to be very successful, and I'm happy. And yes, he's not your run-of-the-mill drug trafficker. He's a guy that, again, I use the word stumbled into it. He did. He never really broke the law as a child. He ended up doing it as an adult, obviously.
You also mentioned that some of the names were changed to protect the guilty, as you indicate. And that brings up a larger question of dealing with libel lawyers, with publishers. If I might, just a brief aside, I'm finishing up the transcript on a book of my own right now that's called The High Road, A Cultural History of Marijuana in America. And I've already been advised that I'm going to have to spend several weeks getting releases signed by people who I tell stories about in this book. They're true, and they're people I have permission to tell, but publishers are concerned about that. Were you required to get written releases from the major players? Now, you mentioned, I think, the chief may no longer be alive.
Chief is not alive anymore.
But Jimmy certainly is, and I assume some of the others may be.
Yeah, the others, and we were very careful with the nicknames, and we just used nicknames. There's one guy named Bicycle Joe who went everywhere on his bicycle, and all he had to his name was a bicycle and a backpack. And in the backpack, he had a backgammon set, and that's what he loved to do. He was from Australia. We've known that Bicycle Joe went down to Australia, we believe, but we're not even positive of that, back in the 70s when he left drug trafficking. So there was no way to get any releases from these guys, but we were very careful. Bicycle was careful. He came to the United States to see the Grand Canyon, the Statue of Liberty, and experience spring break in Fort Lauderdale, which is when he ran into the chief and got a free ride down to Colombia and ended up staying in trafficking. So he had a big detour in his life before he made his money and went home. And I talk about a few other nicknames, but we don't identify anybody by name other than Jimmy. And we've been very careful about that. And I've changed a lot of the names, as well as some of the roads where some of these marinas were located, and what, in fact, type of marinas they were. There was one individual that is on an island down there living now that was elected to public office not long ago. We made sure that we did not put his name or give anybody a hint as to who it might be. And one of the traffickers, oddly enough, who cooperated with federal authorities, according to Jimmy, has ended up here in Washington, D.C. and owns a delicatessen in one of our federal buildings. So it's very bizarre how things turned out. And again, I don't identify who that is.
It was not clear to me as I read this that Jimmy started out with altruism as his motive. As I hear you discuss this today, I realize you believe that Jimmy really was a different kind of marijuana smuggler. But it sounded to me initially that he was trying to get out of poverty. He saw a way to make some money. It's understandable he would have been attracted to that. But you say he wasn't primarily motivated by money, rather for, I think you say, the need to belong to a gang, in this case a nonviolent gang.
But a crew, he calls them a crew.
A group of friends. Yeah. Secondly, the freedom presented by the lifestyle. He traveled all the time, sailed all the time. And then finally, the thrill of sailing the seas and earning his living the same way his ancestors had done. And of course, later he did begin, after he amassed a fortune, I assume, he began to give away some of his money. Did you find that private philosophy, or that philanthropy, a significant part of your appraisal of Jimmy? I mean, did that cause you to think better of him than if he would have not given it away?
Definitely did. You know, he has a heart just talking to him. And since we've written this book, it just came out in May. Many people have already gone down to get their pictures taken with him in Harbor Island. So I'm not sure how much he's enjoying being a celebrity these days. But and Jimmy remains on the island to this day. And by the way, speaking of sailing the seas, he still goes out on his boat whenever he can and goes fishing on Harbor Island with his wife. But yeah, you talked about the freedom. He had just been married. It led to a divorce, what he was doing. His wife, who was actually working for a lawyer in Nassau after this first sale that he had, who did not like him doing this, made him promise he would get out of the business after he earned his first $1 million. He did not do that because he didn't realize how much he would like the camaraderie of the crew. They had a compound in Fort Lauderdale. They were in and out of the Bahamas when they weren't all the way down in Colombia bringing marijuana up. But back to sailing the seas, I alluded at the beginning of the interview to where he grew up on a tiny little island called Long Island. It looks like a bent toothpick or a chewed toothpick down near Hispaniola, where Columbus discovered the West Indies in America, so to speak. And it was very rural. Not much on the island. You could see water no matter where you were because of the width of the island. And he grew up on a farm down there, the same 500-acre tract that the British Crown had given his family more than 200 years ago for being pirates, being buccaneers, and fighting any Spaniard flag that they could find flying from South America up to North America and the islands in between. And other buccaneers were given these parcels of land, and that's where Jimmy grew up. I don't think they got electricity, he said, until 1994. Don't quote me on that, but it's only been of late, so to speak, that they have gotten some. But so Jimmy had this history in his background, and yet he's being educated by his aunt. He was sent to live with his aunt after his mother became ill as a baby in Nassau, and he didn't have the life that his ancestors had had. His father was a fisherman. His father would ferry spices between the Bahamas and Cuba, and Jimmy would do this with him in the summers when he would go home from his schooling in Nassau. And I think he could continue a tradition that began many centuries before. Jacob, his father, even had told his 3 boys, Jimmy had 2 brothers, that their ancestors in later years were actually, would light fires in the middle of the island at times. They were called breakers, I believe. They would have these ships come up. They did this on the Outer Banks. It was very common on some of these outer islands in those years, and have the ships that were ferrying all these supplies back and forth between some of the bigger populated areas run ashore thinking they were looking at a beacon of a lighthouse or something. Then they would go out and they would take everything off the ships. So they were always around water. Jimmy, I think, was glad to be back on it, and he learned a lot from his dad on these, which I write about in the book. He learned everything about the water from his father when they would take these trips to Cuba. Taking salt down there, by the way, from the salt flats that are today the Morton salt flats.
John, it's time for us to take a brief break. We'll be back in a couple of minutes.
Afterwards, with John McCaslin and Keith Stroup, continues.
Welcome back. John, you've stressed that Jimmy Devine was totally nonviolent. In fact, at one part in the book, he tried to fire a gun and didn't even know how to fire. It was lucky he didn't, because he avoided killing someone that would have been probably his death as well.
It would have been.
Yes.
He always said the safest place to be if he's ever holding a gun is in front of the barrel.
Well, do you want to briefly talk about that episode where he fired the gun several times at close range but missed the person?
Yeah, it had to do with the compound that the Colombian cartel that he dealt with, the Cardinals, as I call them in the book. And again, the book I write is based on a true story. I just want to be safe with regard to the libel and everything else you brought up. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't on Oprah Winfrey's couch one day and she goes, wait a minute, that didn't happen. But anyway, the cartel, there was a discrepancy in the amount of marijuana that was loaded onto one of the motherships, one of the freighters that Jimmy and his partner, the chief, had, and down in Colombia. And for this one sale to the crew, the Colombians thought 40,000 pounds was put on. This freighter held 30,000 pounds. The Colombians insisted that an extra 10,000 had been put on board. And the cartel chiefs, the kingpin, so to speak, of the cartel's nephew was in charge of that transfer. And the nephew was just right out of school. He happened to be the son of the cartel leader's sister. So it was his nephew. And Jimmy's not quite sure what happened. Jimmy insists that only 30,000 pounds was put on, and he's thinking maybe this nephew took an extra 10,000 and doled it out somewhere himself. Yeah. Long story short, the kingpin himself came to America with his nephew. They wanted to meet with Jimmy. Jimmy was totally against going into their compound down on this little island, Star Island in Miami, out in the middle of the bay. I believe it's Biscayne Bay, where there's maybe 25 houses. There's only one bridge on and one bridge off, and once you get behind their gates, you know, you could be in a lot of trouble. So Jimmy called, the chief talked Jimmy into going there. The chief had been there before. The chief was a great cook, and he'd been over there to cook for these guys before. They were friends, and they'd done so much business together, internationally speaking. So Jimmy talked to one of his friends who, like Jimmy, Jimmy kickboxed his way through the Bahamas in his youth, which is why he was always so health conscious. He started out in karate and then became one of the top kickboxers in island history, as far as I can ascertain. And he got one of his friends from the United States who was up in Orlando to come down and go with him to the compound. And this guy came with some heat, so to speak. He had two guns, and Jimmy had never held one before. And he said, what am I supposed to do with this? And long story short, they were seated in the house around this huge table, multi-million-dollar home in Miami on this island. And Jimmy had directly across from him, as he described it to me, the nephew with the kingpin on his right. And to his left was his friend that he bought, and then scattered around the room were these Colombian, if you want to call them thugs, you can, but they were members of security. And when this nephew continued to insist that by all means he did load 40,000 pounds on, the kingpin wasn't happy, and he said, Jimmy, I've got two people telling me two stories here, come clean. And Jimmy said, I've already told you the truth, that's all I'm going to tell you. You've dealt with me for years, I've never crossed you before. Jimmy knew what happened when you did cross the Colombians. He'd heard stories and tales before, not always with good outcomes. And it was when the nephew, according to Jimmy, threatened his daughter. Jimmy had a daughter, said, how's your daughter doing now? Jimmy doesn't know what came over him because he's not a violent person, and at that point he pulled out the gun, took several shots, and missed. They went into the table, they went into the armchair, one went through his coat pocket. He had a white cotton coat on like his uncle used to always wear, and then one went into, and I think it probably was the kick took him by surprise and the power of the gun, and then one went into a painting that was on the wall. And Jimmy thought at that moment, as did his buddy that came with him, that they were both dead. And what the kingpin was saying in Spanish was that, wow, this guy was a lizard slayer. How did he shoot and miss? And he told all the guys around the room in Spanish, don't mess with him. And they were allowed to leave. But it was a close call, and the only time Jimmy had ever resorted to violence, so to speak, to make his point.
I'm a little curious. I assume it's fair, since nothing happens totally in a vacuum, to refer to the fact that you're a regular columnist for a somewhat conservative newspaper.
Editorially speaking,
yes. The Washington Times. Yes. I'm wondering how they felt about your presenting a marijuana smuggler in such favorable terms. Did you have to clear the manuscript with them, or did you get any heat from them because of this book?
No, not at all. In fact, I don't think anybody knew I was writing the book, because I was writing it in the midst of a presidential campaign, an unprecedented presidential campaign at that. I wrote the book between 10 p.m. and midnight for about 2.5 months. Because I write all day long, as you know. I just recently stopped writing, or retired from writing the Inside the Beltway column after 18 years of writing a daily column, and now I'm employed in radio full-time through the Times and the Talk Radio Network, nationally syndicated. I've been doing that we just started our 6th week, and I'm very happy to be back in a medium that I started out in. I did thank John Solomon, who's the executive editor, who has been at the Times for about 1.5 years. He came over right after I had probably signed the contract to write the book, from the Washington Post and the Associated Press before that. And I don't think John minded at all. In fact, I gave him a signed copy. I thanked my editors, who were looking the other way when they knew that I was juggling book writing and heading down to the Bahamas to interview Jimmy with Barack Obama and John McCain and all the other cast of characters that we had up here, the crew, so to speak, in Washington, the political crew, while dealing with the other crew. But no permission had to be granted or anything like that. And the thing about the Washington Times, and I will speak for the other reporters there, because I know many of them, I like to say that we are conservative, editorially speaking. On the editorial pages, they make and take a position as similar to the Wall Street Journal and other conservative-leaning newspapers. Sacramento Bee is one that pops to mind, and there's many others in this country. The reporters take offense at that, because they're J-school graduates. They took Journalism 101 and every other course offered, and have come from many respectable newspapers and other news outlets. And they write in the middle of the road for the most part, and they cover both sides. And I think you'll see that in the newspaper. I do believe we are very fair and balanced. And yeah, let the editorial guys up there who don't even put their name on anything, let them be conservative if they want.
The overall account of this Bahamian-based marijuana smuggling conspiracy felt a little sanitized to me, not just Jimmy. And let me briefly explain. I did practice law for a few years, and I did represent drug smugglers. And they seemed to me that they almost always got arrested within a few years. Most of them got arrested multiple times, and most of them ended up spending significant time in prison. Yet in your book, smugglers, this group of smugglers seemed to overcome incredible odds. They squeaked out of some very difficult circumstances. You paint a number of situations where it looked like Jimmy was about to take a fall. And through his wits and luck and whatever, he made it free. It was only after they had grown older and semi-retired. In fact, it sounded as if Jimmy tried to retire 2 or 3 times before they kept coming up with special projects, and he'd get back in the business to help him out for a little bit. But he had actually retired, had never been arrested, and neither had any of the immediate crew he worked with, including the chief, it sounded.
Yeah, there were 2 members of the crew, and Jimmy was actually participating in that operation. He helped tow their boat into a marina, where he said every law enforcement insignia and every jacket made was in that marina waiting for them. They were looking at this other boat that came in that he was pulling in that was one of their boats. They had no idea who Jimmy was. This was one of their strategies. They would go out and pretend one boat had broken down in the water, and the other boat would tow them in, and that way the Coast Guard would never mess with them, because they were glad somebody else was helping this knucklehead with a clogged fuel line, and they didn't have to do it. So they found out that was one way to get boats in when there was a lot of law enforcement presence, and they would monitor that all the time. But there were many close calls, but those 2 crew members were arrested, and the lawyer in Miami that represented them at the time, as told to me by Jimmy, got those guys off because they only found 1 bale. They never found the marijuana that was concealed so beautifully in this boat. I mean, they made these boats custom built to hide drugs. And not just in false gas tanks like a lot of traffickers did that did get arrested. They would build just compartments beneath these boats, spend a lot of money to do it, and nobody could ever find it back then, because as Jimmy pointed out, in those days, when there was very little law enforcement presence, they couldn't even cut a boat in half back in those days. They didn't have the tools to do it. And then they finally caught on. And Jimmy did. He went back to Nassau. I believe he was back there, as to what he told me, for about 2 years before the chief was indicted in Florida, in the United States, and he made a phone call to Jimmy, as Jimmy tells me in the book. and said, you know, you can hang up the phone right now. I'm calling from a federal institution. I've been indicted. You've been indicted. I believe he said one or two other members of the crew had been indicted. They were never nabbed firsthand with any goods on board. It was all by word of mouth from another guy that had been arrested, and they were fingered, and that's what ultimately led to Jimmy coming back to the United States and cooperating with authorities.
Let me ask you to follow up on that. For someone who had been a smuggler for, it looked like almost 2 decades, and big-time smuggling.
A decade.
Yeah, a decade. He ended up turning himself in. I shouldn't say turning himself in. He ended up voluntarily approaching the DEA.
After being indicted.
After he was indicted in the States. Yeah,
right.
been indicted in the States, but he wasn't in the States.
No,
And they hadn't tried to pick him up in the Bahamas yet, although that might have happened eventually. He ended up being, deciding it was in his interest, apparently, to meet with the DEA and to start to debrief. And in fact, that's what we call snitches in the field. Someone who's a smuggler for a decade, like Jimmy, usually detests snitches. They're the lowest form of life. Yet he seemed to convert from a smuggler to a snitch fairly quickly, 180-degree turn. And I guess one of the questions I have is, was he simply doing that, selling out to save his own ass? Did he not have a moral compass? Did he just live by his wits? It seemed to me that he found it awfully easy to switch from being a smuggler to being someone who was locking up other smugglers.
Well, first of all, with regard to snitching, he had to be talked into it by his brother, his stepbrother, who said, I think you need to cooperate with the DEA on this since you've been indicted. And his brother had a friend, who I identify in the book by a different name, who had an in with the DEA in Nassau, and he was the middleman to broker some kind of a communication between the two. They were definitely watching what he did. Jimmy found out later that they had indeed bugged his apartment. He found the bug himself in the phone, and it's kind of funny when if you read in the book what he did just to toy with the DEA when he found this bug. But anyway, remember that when Jimmy was indicted, when he got that phone call announcing by the chief that he'd been indicted, the chief told him in that phone conversation that he was cooperating in the United States with these guys. He said, I've already told them everything I know. I'm sorry I had to do that. I hope we can still remain friends. But Jimmy, they're giving me the deal of the century if I tell them everything I know. So Jimmy knew that the chief had told everything, and obviously he would have said something about Jimmy being the partner that Jimmy was to him.
And I believe I recall they both ended up serving something less than 5 years, and it was suggested that the only reason they served that was that they needed a cover. If they would have somehow gotten out without some time in prison, they might have been a target for current smugglers.
Yeah, you can read between the lines in the book about that. Jimmy tells me that he was sentenced to 5 years. Because he was a government informant in the end, he was given a code number and a code name, which was Blue. And he cooperated with authorities, and he talked about what he knew about trafficking, both cocaine and marijuana, in the Caribbean and in Colombia. And I guess he was a big enough help to them that they realized when the time came for the sentencing, he was only given 5 years. He served it in 2 different federal prisons, one in Florida. Before he knew it, before he could even he loved to read Popular Mechanics magazine and Reader's Digest and National Geographic. He requested those in jail. Before he could even get the first ones delivered to them, they had put him in a bus without any notice and taken him to near Lake Charles, Louisiana, where he served out the rest of his term, and then he was put on a bus, taken to the airport, and flown back to the Bahamas.
Well, I think most of us would agree that for a decade of smuggling and several $1 million, that wasn't such a bad penalty. That's true.
No, he said he walked out of that hearing just on a cloud. He couldn't believe it. He said, in fact, his quote to me was, I could have done that standing on my head. I was so happy.
Let me see if we can bring some of this current. It's clear, we mentioned earlier, that there is some change in attitudes going on in this country, and they're beginning to be reflected, and they're in the direction of not seeing marijuana as being quite so bad and maybe bringing it into the mainstream and taxing it and regulating it. There's a federal bill currently pending. I don't know if you're aware of it, that Barney Frank and Ron Paul and some others have introduced.
I've written about that. Yeah.
What it does basically is it would eliminate all federal penalties for the possession of up to 3.5 ounces of marijuana, and also, importantly, for the not-for-profit transfer of up to 1 ounce of marijuana. Now, most people forget, but those were the recommendations of the Marijuana Commission back in 1972. What people remember is the commission said we ought to stop arresting smokers, and they did. And there were 11 states during the 70s that sort of did that. They lost their political will. They didn't totally decriminalize it. Most of them kept a $100 fine. Some states it was a civil fine, some it was criminal. But at least you weren't arrested, you weren't threatened with jail. But the part that they didn't do, the Marijuana Commission recognized that in the marijuana culture, if you buy 3 or 4 ounces of marijuana, you generally share it with your friends. We all have 1 or 2 contacts and we take turn. That's the way you get marijuana in an illegal market. So they saw no reason to treat those not-for-profit sales as crimes. The Barney Frank Ron Paul bill would do that. It would take the federal government out of these minor marijuana offenses altogether. Now, it doesn't require the states to do anything. Those states that want to retain criminal penalties are free to do it. Those that want to eliminate possession penalties, and frankly, those that would like to begin to experiment with legalization models, such as the bill that's been introduced in California this year and another in Massachusetts, would be free to do that. What's your impression? Is that realistic? Does that make sense? Is that still out of step with the body politic?
Not when I read the statistics of the number of people that still are arrested basically for, smoking a joint or 2 of marijuana, which is way below the 3.5 ounce, proposal that this legislation offers.
John, if I can just intercede, that number last year was 870,000 Americans arrested on marijuana charges, and 89% were for an ounce or less.
Right, and I've read the statistics of what that does to a police department, whether it's local or even federal authorities when they have to step in. And they talk about what can be saved if they didn't, and just in terms of manpower, if they didn't have to deal with this. I just read today that to watch Barack Obama's house in Chicago, even though he doesn't live in it anymore, is costing the city of Chicago since November over $2 million just to post a couple policemen out in front of the house, which I find astronomical. Well, multiply that by every arrest that you're going through and the manpower it takes to arrest that, what did you say, 800 and some thousand people during that period. It definitely would help lessen the burden on these law enforcement agencies if they did that, without saying, yes, I would be happy if they did it or not. But I think many countries have decriminalized to that extent. Some countries, as you know, outright. Portugal did it recently. Anything goes over there. I think this would be a first step towards regulating, or at least experimenting with the regulation of something to see if it did work. And if it didn't, hey, come back and somebody else introduce a bill on the Hill and say we've got to rescind that. It's not working.
Well, and indeed, I think we all recognize that whatever happens first in this area legislatively is going to be a trial program.
Right.
And you're absolutely right. If they tried to legalize small amounts of marijuana in a state, and if they found the sky was falling, it would not take them long to go back to criminal penalties.
Sure.
But it's sort of interesting to point out to the public, because I don't think they all realize it, but in a number of states in this country, they have legalized marijuana. It's not absolute.
Right.
But for example, in both California and Colorado, if you have there are 13 states altogether, where if you have a physician's recommendation that says you would benefit from the use of marijuana as a medicine, you are legally allowed to grow it.
Sure.
You can possess it. You can designate a caregiver who can grow it for you in case you're not in the situation to grow your own. In most of those states, it's fairly easy to get that doctor's recommendation. Most people can qualify. Not all of them. Some of the state laws were drafted more sternly. But in particular in California and Colorado, there are dispensaries. There are stores where if you have your medical recommendation, you can walk in and you'll have a choice of 20 or 30 or 40 varieties of marijuana, some of which are supposed to be better for particular kinds of conditions, others for others. That's right. The cancer, chemotherapy. So we actually have legalization in some states in this country, and the sky hasn't fallen. So I suppose the question is, now that we're in an economic downturn where states are really having to hustle to get their budgets in order, California in particular, they've been issuing IOUs now for some time. The estimate is they could raise $1.4 billion if they simply legalized marijuana in California, and in effect it's legal already in California.
Yeah. And multiply that nationally and what it could do for the economy, and they have come out with figures as to how much they could inject into the economy and at the same time save with regard to this other proposal of decriminalizing. You know, Barack Obama was asked about that in April during a town hall meeting. He has so much on his plate. In the 3 decades I've been here in Washington as a journalist, I have never seen a president come in and do so much. So will they ever get to legalization beyond what's going to take place with Dana Rohrabacher and Barney Frank and Ron Paul with this legislation? And those are some pretty big heavyweight names,
yes,
by the way.
Indeed they are. Two of whom are very conservative.
Yeah, former
Ron Paul's
Reaganites,
libertarian.
Reaganite guys, yeah. So anyway, there are arguments as to how much it would put in, and would that be profitable for the U.S. to do at this time as one cure to the ailing economy. And Barack Obama, and if you'll remember during the campaign, he said, so a reporter asked him, did you used to smoke marijuana? And he said, yes, I did. In fact, I think he did other drugs as well, if I read correctly. And I apologize if I'm not, but I think he had tried
No, he
other
says
drugs.
in his first book that he used cocaine for a while as well.
Right. And then the reporter asked him, a la Bill Clinton, did you inhale? And he looked at the reporter and he goes, well, that was the whole point, wasn't it? But anyway, in that town hall meeting in April, he said that I don't think at this time that legalizing marijuana would be a cure for the economy. So right now, no, I would be against doing that. At the same time, there's the argument that it might help quell some of these gang fights that are taking place, the drug fights that have now come into the United States from Mexico. And so there's that side of the argument.
I think also with Obama, a lot of my colleagues, people who have long favored legalizing marijuana, are disappointed that Obama hasn't run out and said something more definite. They were especially offended that he made a joke at that press conference when asked about legalizing marijuana. It seems to me, maybe it's because I've been in Washington too long, but I think those expectations were unrealistic. In other words, as you pointed out, this president came into office with more serious problems on his desk that he didn't create. I mean, he inherited them. So had he have come right out of the box and started focusing on legalizing marijuana,
it might have backfired on
I think it would have been idiocy.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have even supported that. Yeah. But I do suspect that as we get a year or two into his administration, we will probably get more support, because it has to be helpful to have a president who not only has smoked marijuana, I think the last 3 or 4 have all smoked marijuana, but who acknowledges that he smoked marijuana and doesn't say it was such a terrible experience. He apparently smoked quite a lot of it for a few years when he was younger.
Yeah.
What I do appreciate that Obama has done, and you may have observed this as well, remember that for a long time under President Bush, the second, the federal government was stepping into some of these states that have decided to legalize the medical use of marijuana, and the feds were making arrests. They were just running roughshod over the state policies. Obama, to his credit, instructed his Attorney General, and his Attorney General Eric Holder has said on a couple of occasions, so long as folks are following the state law, the state medical use laws, the Department of Justice will not interfere. I think that's a significant step forward.
And there were even, Keith, problems with the industrial use of hemp.
Yes, indeed.
And federal interdiction in that, when it was almost ridiculous because it didn't have any of the quality of the marijuana that you would need to ever smoke it. You wouldn't have smoked that. No.
You can't get high from hemp. Most of the hemp that's grown in this country was grown by the federal government in World War II when there was a hemp shortage, when the Philippines were cut off. So every year the federal government makes a big deal out of spending all kinds of millions of dollars, and look at all this hemp we've harvested. It is not hemp that you can smoke. It's like 1/4% THC. Good marijuana is 6 to 8 to 10 or higher.
No THC. It makes a great rope and many other things.
And also, most people probably don't realize this, but farmers all over the world are allowed to grow industrial hemp, including Canada and Western Europe, as I say, Russia.
Sure.
We can import industrial hemp, and we can make any number of products out of it, and it is, in fact, clothing as well as all kinds of health foods.
Sure.
But our farmers, if they try to grow hemp, are in fact treated as marijuana growers, and they are arrested. There are 3, maybe 4 states now where the state legislature has passed laws saying we want to legalize the cultivation of industrial hemp by our farmers, and they cannot implement it because, for the moment, the federal government still has that block.
Right. I've been writing about that over the years, and I find it just outrageous.
Yeah, I guess it shows the power of symbolism.
Yeah.
Our opponents on this apparently are afraid that if the average American begins to understand that marijuana is not an evil substance, it can be used, it can be abused, it can be used industrial, they can't maintain prohibition. It seems to me they're losing that fight, but I think they're losing it overall. We've got data showing 86% of the country now support the medical use of marijuana, and roughly 76% say 76% of the people say that a marijuana smoker should be fined, no arrest and no jail. Now that's not perfect from NORML standpoint, but on the other hand, it says that 3 out of 4 Americans have now accepted the basic premise that you should not treat a responsible marijuana smoker like a criminal. So I believe we've largely won the hearts and minds of the American public. Our challenge is how to translate that into public policy. You work on the Hill all the time. You know there is oftentimes a big gap between where the American public is and where our elected officials are. They still remain concerned that if they show any reasonable position on marijuana policy, they'll be called soft on drugs. Certainly. And they'll be thrown out of office.
Yeah, and I think that's with this new legislation, these proponents who are backing it are talking about the responsible use, as you just alluded to, of marijuana. You know, you can go out and drink a whole bottle of gin and you're going to go out and wreck your car and kill somebody, and nobody's proposing anybody sit around and take bong hits all day and then get out in their car. They're not going to be of any use to the community. They probably couldn't hold a job. What they're talking about is responsible use, like with alcohol, that could be controlled, regulated by the government, that might turn out to be something that could help everybody.
Yeah, without question, I think whatever the substance, responsible use is the key factor. I do want to stress this, that even groups like NORML, who've always favored legalizing marijuana, we have a position paper called The Principles of Responsible Cannabis Use, and one of the first principles is it's not for kids, and the second is don't drive when you're stoned.
Right.
There seems to be a myth out there among a lot of marijuana smokers that if you get stoned, you drive better. That is not what the research shows. The research shows you're much safer driving stoned than drunk because the kind of mistakes you make with alcohol are deadly. You tend to speed and you pass in inappropriate situations, and the results are often deadly. With marijuana, you tend to drive a little too slowly. You're not sure if you've approached, if you're approaching the exit you want, or if you just passed it, so you slow down. But we don't want people on the road driving impaired with anything.
No,
so
we don't.
let me make sure that everyone understands. We're saying responsible use, and we're saying if you smoke marijuana, don't drive for 3 or 4 hours. It's not safe. Let me briefly, we only have a couple of minutes left, talk about your other book, Inside the Beltway. I found it fascinating when I read that you seem to find a lot about Washington, D.C. and Capitol Hill and people inside the Beltway that you wanted to poke fun at. Some of them angered you. You didn't appear to like a lot of what you found. Now, I understand you were picking out the things you didn't like. But like myself, you've lived here for a number of years. Why the hell do you stay in Washington if you find it so uncomfortable?
Well, you know, I don't find it that uncomfortable at all. You know, this is a politically driven town. I was born inside the Beltway in Old Town Alexandria, right across the Potomac River. It used to be part of the city of Washington until Virginia went its way. And I don't think that there's that much negativity in the book at all. I try to put a human face on all these lawmakers that we hear about every day. The 8 years, a good chunk of the book takes up 8 years of the Clinton administration, because I started writing the column in '92 when Bill Clinton came in office. So it just so happens that that's going to be 8 of the years. And you've got to admit it was a pretty stormy 8 years. And I picked out more of the humorous stories that transpired during the Clinton White House. And the book ends on 9/11. And how that impacted me and my family and everybody else in America, because that was right up to the time that I finished writing the book and taking the notes. So I think anybody that reads Inside the Beltway, I see you've got a paperback copy there. It's gone paperback now. We'll find a lot of humorous, all true tales that have been told inside Washington that they will not have read anywhere else. And just like Weed Man, I picked out the funniest stories from the trafficking days, like when they stored the marijuana in the basements of churches, and how he got marooned on the island with 40,000 pounds of weed and built a house out of the bales. And I try to bring a little humor to the beat.
Yes.
Which is what I've done in this case.
John, thank you very much. I've enjoyed this discussion. I would urge our viewers to take a fresh look at marijuana smuggling and read The Weed Man.
Thank you, Keith. I appreciate it very much.